Zeke looked straight into the teenage girl's wide eyes. Wait, what? Zeke asked. Do you like me? As in, well, Sarah said. A light blush started to form on her face as Zeke started to get red. He didn't have very much experience with girls. Well, Zeke said. Come on, just tell me. We may not have another chance anytime soon, Sarah said. Look, I could be a bit oblivious at times, but I know my dad doesn't like you, and Clem's a little too young to understand. Zeke sighed and he said, Okay, I do have a crush on you. See, that wasn't so hard, Sarah said, a smile forming on her lips. I know, it's just, I haven't had the best of luck with girls, Zeke said. Did you ever date one before all of this happened? Sarah asked. Kind of. It never really worked out. Besides, it was more puppy love. I didn't exactly understand it all, Zeke said. Okay, do you understand it now? Sarah asked. I think so, Zeke said. I know that I think you're cute and nice and fun, but pretty. Sarah blushed more and she said, No one's ever said that about me before. Remember I said I was bullied a lot? Zeke nodded his head a little and continued. I got bullied by both boys and girls. I thought that I could at least try to find one friend who was like me, but I didn't have much luck. Eventually the bullying got so bad that my dad pulled me out of public school and put me in a private school. Did the private school prevent any further bullying? Zeke asked. No, they really cracked down on that stuff. It was kind of overbearing. I felt like the staff was watching every little thing we did. Plus, I hated the uniform. It was an ugly gray dress, Sarah said. Zeke chuckled and said, Well, you got through it. Yeah, Sarah said. She shook her head and she said, I'm sorry, I'm just complaining. I know you don't want to listen. How about we do something like, maybe kiss? I mean, we are dating now, right? If that's what you want. I'm not so sure if I would, Zeke trailed off. The question was abnormal at best. Please, Sarah said with pleading eyes. Zeke looked into the girl's eyes before he leaned in and kissed her on the lips. This was something. Suddenly the two started to hug each other, and finally after a few seconds they separated. That was so cool, Sarah said with a huge grin on her face. My first kiss. She rustled out of Zeke's grip with every red at this point. Sarah giggled and she said, No offense, but you're red as a cherry. Zeke shook his head and said, Speak for yourself. Sarah started to laugh at that. I don't know what to think. I mean, I want to like it. I've always wanted a boyfriend, but I don't know about how that kiss, Sarah said. Well, we might still be a bit young and definitely have inexperienced. This was my first kiss too, Zeke said. Oh, okay. It's also not a bad thing if I don't feel that much. I mean, I thought I would feel something more from my kiss, Sarah said. Don't get me wrong, I did feel like I liked it. It's just I thought it would be something more. It's normal, Sarah, Zeke said. Just like anything you do for the first time. It starts off weird and unusual, but it'll get better as time goes on. Sarah's smile returned to normal and she said, That's good. Thanks, Zeke. I'm glad you're not a bully. Suddenly Clementine entered the room with Genevieve in her arms. The toddler had a pacifier in her mouth. Clem, Sarah said. She turned to the teenagers and said, Sorry to interrupt your makeout session. We weren't making out, Zeke and Sarah said at the same time. Clementine rolled her eyes and she said, I wasn't born yesterday. It's also gross. Anyway, I think Carver's at the door. Are you sure? Zeke asked. Clementine nodded in response. Zeke went to the door and he turned around and said, You three need to hide. I can just take care of that. Just see if you can get rid of him or something, Sarah said. Zeke nodded before he left the room. Zeke went downstairs but was surprised to hear the door open. He saw a man with a brown coat enter the house. He eyed up at Zeke and said, Rather rude not to answer the door. Well, I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I was looking after my baby sister. I didn't know you were knocking until now, Zeke lied. His tone of voice was quite sarcastic. The man took at him with an offended stare and said, Don't be disrespectful. The way I see it, you'll only get respect if it's earned. and so far you haven't earned any ounce of my respect yet, Zeke said. Touchy, the man said. Let's start over. What's your name? Ezekiel, Zeke said. Ezekiel? Your folks religious or something? The man said. I don't mind, Zeke said. What's your name? Me? My name's George, the man said. He looked around. This is a nice real place. So it's just you and your baby sister? What's her name? Jen, Zeke said. Zeke could tell that there was something off about the man. Clementine was probably right. This must have been Carver. Interesting name, George said. Anyway, I'll cut to the chase. I'm looking out for my people. You see, they've been gone a long time, and I'm afraid they must have gotten lost. A couple of farm boys, an old man, a Spanish man and his daughter. Quiet girl. She's a bit shorter than you. A big black guy about this big. He showed how big the man's stomach was with his arms before he continued. And a pretty lady and a smart girl. She's a little over 11 right now. That's a lot of people to lose, Zeke said. Tell me about it. This whole damn thing is a mess, George said. He then turned to the kitchen and went inside. Zeke followed behind and entered the kitchen. George was looking around until he spotted the sink. Lots of place for just one person and a baby. I don't exactly have a lot of time to do dishes. I'm so busy looking after Jen, Zeke said. I guess that makes sense, George said. Zeke looked around and noticed a knife on the counter. He might have made sure that George didn't make a move for the knife. Just so you know, I'm passing through, or you've been here a while, George asked. Zeke looked back at the man as he continued. Listen, kid, I hope you're not going north hoping to find Shangri-La. I'm not sure why anyone would ever want to find a place like this. I'm not sure. I guess it's a good setup for now, Zeke said. Exactly. Too many people now these days are heading up north. They won't find anything up there. It's just like a whole lot of nothing, George said. The cold could slow the walkers down, Zeke said. Well, yeah, that's not worth the trade-off to me, George said. Zeke eyed the knife again and then looked back at George. George noticed this knife and started to make his way over to the counter. Zeke grabbed his bow and rested across his body and readied himself. Relax, I'm just putting it back, George said. Can't be too careful, Zeke said. Very true, George said. He placed the knife on the drawer and then turned back to Zeke. He turned and walked out of the kitchen and went to the living room. Zeke followed him. He still had his bow in his hand and he saw George approach the sofa. Zeke walked over and saw George looked at a shirt that was on the sofa. I used to know someone who wore a shirt like this. Real smug son of a bitch. I guess you two didn't get along, Zeke said. We had moments of cooperation, but at the end he still betrayed me, George said. There was a loud noise coming from upstairs. What was that? George asked. Might have been Jen, Zeke said. Maybe, George said. He pulled out a gun and went upstairs. Whoa, hold on, Zeke said. How do you know you're not going to shoot Jen? If someone was in that room other than me, she would be wailing right now. You said it earlier, you can't be too careful, George said as he made his way up the stairs. Zeke followed behind the man. He couldn't believe the situation that Sarah and the girls were about to be in. George opened the door and aimed a gun. Zeke made it inside to well see Genevieve. She was on the floor playing with her blocks, but had dropped and started to whimper at the sight of George. Zeke walked past George, and Genevieve started to cry in fear. Shh, it's okay, Zeke said as he picked up the toddler and started to bob her in her arms. Sorry. I guess I should have taken your word, George said. Will you please leave now? Zeke asked. Your people are not here, as far as I can tell. Very well, George said. However, he looked up around the room and noticed a picture on the floor. He picked up the picture and had sent a sinister smile looking towards Zeke. Who are these two? George asked as he held up the picture of Sarah and Clementine. Zeke didn't flinch. I don't know, Zeke said. I hadn't seen that picture till now. Must have belonged to people who were here last. Liar, George said. He went up to Zeke and took a hold of him. He started to push him against the hallway and started to choke him. Genevieve had fallen off of Zeke's grasp in the attack and she was now bawling on the floor. George continued to strangle Zeke until the boy fought back. You know what happens to liars, boy? They die, George said. Zeke gritted his teeth and pulled out his knife from his holster, plunged the knife into Carver's arm. The man groaned in pain and released the grip, and Zeke stepped back from him. Zeke gasped for air before he went to his bow. George pulled out the knife and said, "This will be a lot easier if you die now." "Not happening, Carver," Zeke said. He pulled away from the arrow and looked at Carver. The older man lunged for Genevieve, who was still on the ground crying. Zeke aimed the bow when Carver got a hold of Genevieve. The same knife that Zeke had used to keep her alive for so long was now being threatened with her life. She immediately stopped crying and looked at Zeke with worried stare. "Don't," Zeke said. "It seems I found your Achilles heel," Carver said with a smirk forming on his face. "How about a little exchange? Your life or hers, unless you want me to slit her throat." The door opened from behind Zeke and turned to see Clementine at the doorway. "Clementine," Carver said with a smile. "I was wondering where you were." Clementine held a gun in her hand, and she looked at Carver with a tense stare. "You're going to let her go and leave," Clementine said. "Or what? We both know you don't have the heart to shoot me," Carver said. "After all, you might shoot the baby by accident." "You're right," Clementine said. She turned the gun on herself. "But I'm not going to shoot you. If you don't leave now, so you can say goodbye to your heir." Zeke's eyes widened. The girl was going to commit oof. Or Zeke noticed that the same gun was used to teach Sarah. The gun wasn't loaded, however Carver didn't know that. For all he knew, the gun was loaded. Carver was so astonished he had a smile fade into a look of worry on his face. "Now let's talk about this," said Carver. "I'm going to start counting," Clementine said. Her finger was nearing the trigger. Carver gritted his teeth before dropping the baby and the knife to the ground. Well played, Clementine. Till we meet again." Carver went down the stairs while Zeke went over and picked up Genevieve. They soon heard the door slam from downstairs. Clementine released a breath before tossing the gun to the side. "Clem, don't get me wrong. Thanks for helping me back there, but don't ever put a gun to your head," Zeke said. "Desperate times calls for desperate measures," Clementine said. She shook her head and she said, "I don't feel good. I'm going to go to bed for a little while." "Okay, Sarah and I will come check on you every once in a while," Zeke said. Clementine nodded and went into the room where she came out of. Zeke turned his head to when he saw Sarah coming out from under the bed. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Zeke said. "Carver nearly strangled me, and both Clem and Jen are scared to death, but no one is physically hurt." Sarah nodded and said, "I could take care of Jen if you want to go to talk to Clem." "Yeah, that might be best," Zeke said. He handed Genevieve off to Sarah. The toddler whimpered, but she seemed to calm down a bit when Sarah talked to her. "It's okay," Sarah said to Genevieve. "Let's go play with some blocks." Zeke went over to the doorframe and watched Sarah interact with the toddler. He then went to the room where Clementine was. He walked over to the bed and sat down next to where she laid. "I've been where you are right now," Zeke said. "Scared. What you're willing to do to keep your friends or family safe." Clementine sat upright and she said, "I did the right thing." "You just went about it the wrong way," Zeke said. "I understand. I did the same thing for a while. At least you realized it immediately." "Are you going to tell Mom and Dad?" Clementine asked. Zeke shook his head and he said, "Not this time. But you can't do that again. For one thing, Carver won't take that bluff twice, and for another, that was dangerous." Clementine nodded and said, "I know. I hope I don't do it again." "Yeah, we better get ready to move," Zeke said. "Since Carver knows we're here, it'll be a matter of time till he returns." "What about my mom and dad?" Clementine asked. "We'll wait as long as we can, but if they're not here in the next 30 minutes, then there's nothing we can do," Zeke said. Clementine frowned before she nodded her head.